Look at all these people. Goodness me, there's a lot of vitality in this room. This on? Can I hear you? Okay. Great. First of all, may I say at the outset how impressed I am looking at all of you who are here today. I'm sure there are better places for you to be on a Saturday afternoon after a very tiring week in the classroom, but your presence here today really is significant in the sense of understanding the issues that you must be facing on a day-to-day basis in your classrooms. And your commitment to be here today is significant as professional educators, recognizing the difficulties that you face in the classroom with the diversities that you have and the growth that we see in the province. My responsibility this morning is to take you on a brief journey of the history of human rights in Alberta, a somewhat sad history in many regards. For, as Winston Churchill said, to those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. So we must learn from our history, and we must grow from our history. I want to commence my journey with you today by dealing in dirt, which I will start on the day August 22nd, 1935. Now that's a very significant day in Alberta's history. It was the day I was born. You're probably unaware of that. But more important, it was August 22nd, 1935, when Bible Bill Aberhart was elected to be the premier in the province of Alberta. And that was very significant, and I could go back earlier than that, dealing in terms of human rights. There were lots of things we can talk about prior to August 22nd, 1935, when we deal in terms of discrimination and prejudice faced by our Indigenous people, our Chinese citizens, our slave labor, on and on. This is a lengthy story to be told about the history of Alberta in that regard. But I'm going to start August 22nd, 1935. My father, in honor of Aberhart, wanted to call me Abe. My mother said, no way, we're not going to do that. So I answered to Ron, and that's where it will stay. But meanwhile, dealing in terms of the racist history in Alberta, one can start with Bible Bill Aberhart as far as the legislation that was passed by his government. His government was noted to be the most insensitive government in Canada in dealing with human rights matters. His was the government that brought into play the Sterilization Act. Some of you may be familiar with that, which meant they could sterilize people with supposed mental incapacities, prostitutes, or whoever they felt at the time should be sterilized. They're also the government that brought into play the Communal Properties Act. And that was an act that prohibited the Hutterite community from acquiring any further lands. These were not proud pieces of legislation, and there were many others. His government was also regarded as being the most anti-Semitic government in the history of Canada, with many of the programs that it brought into play. So for 36 years, we had a social credit government, so it's many honorable people, but a social credit government that had no sensitivity to human rights issues. A government that right at the end of their time, before the Lougheed government came into play, passed the first human rights legislation, which was kind of a weak-kneed kind of human rights piece of legislation, and they're hopeful would get them some ethnic votes, I suspect. In 1972, when the Lougheed government surprisingly came into office, the first thing that government did was to bring in a Bill of Rights and an Individual Rights Protection Act. And those pieces of legislation, of which were numbers 1 and 2 in their legislative agenda of the government at that time, brought Alberta into the forefront of human rights legislation in the country. These legislation created what is known as the Alberta Human Rights Commission. And at that time, Premier Lougheed stated that the most important commission that he would ever appoint would be the membership to that Human Rights Commission. And he appointed Dr. Max Wyman, who was the retired president of the University of Alberta, to be the chairman of a very distinguished group. And so, from the point of view of movements forward at that time, it was very significant for those of us that believe in the human rights agenda. But later on, things fell apart. And from that day forward, the commitment of the government of Alberta to human rights issues have fell by the wayside. The Human Rights Commission, which was appointed by the Lougheed government, if you looked at it today, is really a non-existent institution for all intents and purposes. They are underfunded by the government. They are silent. They are not dealing in terms of what they are intended to deal with, which was advocacy and education. They spend all their time dealing in the areas of complaints and dealing in terms of arbitrating complaints. Now that's important, but that was only one facet of what they were intended to do, and they'd fallen by the wayside in all other aspects of it. As a result, we have a Human Rights Commission. Is silent. Have you heard anything from them recently? Have you heard anything from them in the past few days? And I'll deal with that in a few more. So we have lots of examples in Alberta of human rights matters. The first one, bring to your attention, of course, and many of you will remember it, and that was the story of James Keystra, the mayor of the town of Eckhill in Alberta. He was the mayor, he was the high school principal, he owned the garage in the town, and he was teaching that there was no Holocaust. And it went on for a number of years, very anti-Semitic in his approach, until finally two women who saw the work that was coming back from the school finally complained. And they went through a whole process, a complaining process, and got really little sympathy from various segments, and they might exactly include the ATA in that one, whereby no one was really paying attention, but it got international recognition. And from that international recognition, Premier Lougheed created a group called the Committee of Tolerance and Understanding, which I was honored to chair. So we traveled Alberta for 18 months. We met people from every corner of dollars. We're in schools, we're on reservations, we were meeting wherever we could. We received hundreds of statements and recommendations and the like, and we issued a report. The interesting part of that report was that at the start, after we moved around, we issued a white paper. The white paper said that one of the greatest areas that needs to be resolved is the area of education of our Indigenous people. The minister called me and he said, "Ron, why are you referring to that? You're hired to look in terms of the public school system and how a teacher in the public school system could come forward and do the things that Keystra did." And we said to the minister that the most important discrimination that we have seen is the discrimination in our schools that was faced by our Indigenous people. And that was the start of our report. The report highlighted many things, and a lot of it dealing, of course, with education and the matters that each and every one of you deal with on a daily basis. And we said in that report, one quote, and this goes back now to 1984, when the report was released. And it said in the report, one quote, "The role of the school is immensely important in assisting our children to become more aware and understanding of the basic concepts of tolerance and understanding and respect of all people, notwithstanding their origins or philosophical backgrounds." And so the report was filed. We ended up closing down a number of schools that didn't have accredited teachers or followed the curriculum because all they were indoctrination centers. And we ended up working on the curriculum. which is something I think they should be doing today in a slightly different way than they're doing it. You know more about that. But there are other cases that bring to your attention. There was the Brandon case. You may be familiar with a case of Brandon, who was a school teacher, I think in the Christian school, that was fired when they found out he was gay. And as a result, they then he went to the Human Rights Commission for assistance, got nowhere with that. The group of lawyers went pro bono, took the case through at first level in trial division. It was found that he was dealt with inappropriately. That was appealed, went to the Supreme Court of Alberta, and the argument was, is the government of Alberta required to recognize sexual orientation as an abusive area within the legislation? The Court of Appeal in Alberta said the Alberta government had no obligation in that regard. It went to the Supreme Court of Canada. I remember that day because I was there. And frankly, it was an embarrassment to be an Albertan at that time, because the government of Alberta was saying if the government wishes to deal with sexual orientation or avoid it, that they have every right to do so. There's no obligation on the government at all to deal in that area. The Supreme Court of Canada was down to the lawyers from Alberta and said, you're wrong. There is an obligation from the point of view of the government of Alberta, and amend your legislation to include sexual orientation. And that was finally done, but only under the guise and under the control and under the order of the Supreme Court of Canada. And so sexual orientation is now in our legislation. The next case that was of interest was my friend Darren Lund. Darren was a teacher in Red Deer at Lazy Thurber High, I think it was called. And he became aggrieved over a pastor that was making really abusive, terrible comments about members of the gay population. It was printed in the Red Deer Advocate newspaper. He then went to the Human Rights Commission. They did nothing. He then went public with it and then carried on through, went legal with it. And during this whole time was facing abuse from people who were threatening his family and the like. He eventually got a doctorate and got here at the University of Calgary in the Department of Education. A very fine man, but he went really through hell as he went through that and got no assistance from the government dealing in that context. We also had the Premier of Alberta, Premier Klein, who came out opposed to gay marriage, you may recall. And as we dealt with that with a lot of pressure on him, he backed off on that and moved the other way. We also had in Provo, Alberta, a meeting of white supremacists. Some of them came out of Idaho, you may know about that. We had signs by the roadside that had swastikas and all kinds of negative anti-Semitic comments. And that went through a hearing that actually was taken by the Human Rights Commission, one of the good things that they've done, and they were found to be in contravention of the legislation. Then, of course, we had the youths recently in Fort McLeod, Alberta, that vandalized a theater where they're having a gay drag show, and that got a lot of attention, and that was just recently. So lastly, in preparing my address for you today, I vowed to stay away from politics, because this is not a political organization. But in the last couple of days, a few things have happened in the province of Alberta that I really freaked out. I was outraged. It probably one of the most egregious discriminatory act against the LGBTQ community and act against children. And with the disregard that was shown by our government, with the announcement they made, you're all aware of it, that really without any consultation with medical people, without any consultation with parents, really, without any consultation with members of the LGBTQ community, the government decided that they were going to deal with the so-called transgender problem. it was probably one of the most egregious discriminatory act that we've seen by the government in the province in some time. So I concluded that if I was to discuss human rights with you today in context of our province, that I could not ignore really the travesty of what is happening in our province right now. Now, I don't know if many of you agree with that, you know. It's somewhat reminds us of the sterilization legislation that the government. It's not totally that the analysis to it, but basically it is the same type of thing where the government feels that they can do something on their without the knowledge, without the background, without the consultation that is affecting so many people. That's helplessly in many regards. So sadly, it seems to me that Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson are alive and well. Yeah. So, excuse me. So here we now have a government that is ignoring the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that is ignoring the Individual Rights Protection Act, and is moving along on their own without any real true respect for what is happening. I say to them, shame on them, and shame on them. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, with eating illegal foreign, I want to mention what it's all about. It's a non-profitable corporation that was put together some 2 years ago by a number of dedicated Albertans who are active in this particular area, particularly out of Edmonton and out of Calgary. We were very concerned with what the statistics were showing relative to the rise in racism, the attitudes that we see in the province. We were very concerned with the dehumanization of our Indigenous, Muslim, Chinese, and Jewish communities by those who harbor such hatred in their hearts. We were concerned with the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, as we saw our mosques and synagogues being vandalized under lock and key and protected by armed guards. Amongst this backdrop of these concerns, we have changes that are occurring in Alberta that are affecting all of our lives. The demographics of our city are changing materially. The demographics are such that what we're facing is a full change in our population. Calgary has the third highest proportion of immigrants in the Canadian urban population. 4 out of 10 Calgarians are visible minorities, being 41% of our population. It is estimated that within the next 15 years, the non-white population will exceed the white population in our city. So with this demographic background and the alarming rise in hate crimes and racism in our community, the members of our Dignity Forum in Calgary and Edmonton determined to focus their activities on advocacy and education, areas where the Human Rights Commission doesn't seem to be. And this brought us to the offices of the superintendent of the CBE and their close colleagues, and some are here, John's here today, I noticed, and I think we found a very favorable reception when we came to the board, suggesting that what we should really do is help our teachers understand difficulties that are out there in the community, how to respond to these issues, and if there's something we could do to bring people together, and as a result, that's why we're happy to be here today. The response was immediate, displayed a willingness to enter into a collaboration, and so now we created a collaboration with the CBE, the ATA, our friends from the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, and many other Albertans who are very much involved in this regard. In conclusion, let me end by commenting that one really is not born to be a bigot. Such attitudes are a virus framed at many levels in the community. We must reach out to our young so that they can understand the harmful consequences of a racist society. There is a golden rule that basically is simple, but really is the base of what we're talking about. And the golden rule that we're all familiar with, it says, to do unto them as you would have to do unto you. The golden rule for the history of mankind has too often been forgotten or ignored as prejudice, discrimination, racism, genocide have all fallen in its wake. Deep fissures have arisen where people of color, ethnicity, religions, race, and sexual orientation have felt the sting of prejudice and the resulting dehumanization and loss of dignity, with all their dramatic impacts upon our citizens in loss of jobs, inadequate health care, fewer educational opportunities, inferior housing, poverty, and the elements mentally that they face on a daily basis, including depression, crime, suicides, and psychological harm occasioned on these individuals living in a racist world. I think it is time. It is time to stand up and not tolerate these abuses and work to create a society based on equal opportunity, acceptance, and inclusion, and approach new initiatives. One of these initiatives must be undertaken in the classrooms in Alberta. The catalyst must be educators, by very heavy responsibility on all of your shoulders. That is why we meet today, to learn and discuss how to fulfill these obligations. I look forward to the discussions and wish you all a worthwhile peace release.